war in Ukraine, the war of Russia against Ukraine, to be specific, reminds us that poetry, whatever its primary goal or its preferences, sometimes has to respond directly or indirectly to physical violence, to horror, to look into the face of horrible events, and to give testimony, as in Czesław Miłosz's famous line, "Do not be safe, the poet remembers."
Today is a well-known Ukrainian poet, Vasyl Makhno, who will present the poem by Janusz Schubert, Pardubice, May 20th, 1916. Mr. Makhno, please, could you read the poem?
Thank you for inviting me for this reading and communication. Okay, I'm gonna to read that Janusz Schubert, Pardubice, May 20, 1916. A photo, postcard-sized, broken in 1/3. Several small defects, a note on the back in chemical pencil. Pardubice, Bohemia, May 20, 1960s. Two soldiers leaning on the wicker table with a fake rose, flat trees and gazebo behind, rumpled, jolly, rosettes on their filled caps, buckles with two-headed eagles, cigarettes between their fingers, handlebar mustaches. In their intense, joyful eyes, an infected appetite for life, daring blood, surging sperm, one of 1,000 moments, a short click and long after. If they weren't killed, if they survived, maybe they died at last in their senile beds, chewing a plug at turf with their toothless gums, fired again in ash-colored clay. Desiccated shadows on the margins of another possessive youth.
Thank you so much. I would like to ask, why did you choose the poem, and what is your connection, the poet and the poem, and what is your connection with Janusz Schubert?
Yes, it's a long story. Many years ago, probably in 1999, I met with Professor Janina Mianowska from Toruń at the conference in Poland, probably in Zielona Góra. Since we only spoke about poetry, and Professor Mianowska told me something about the poet Janusz Schubert. This name for me was unknown. Later, I had been sent a couple of Janusz books through the mail, and I began to read and quickly understand that Schubert is someone unusual in contemporary Polish poetry. Why? First off, he doesn't have a typical biography. He lives in a provincial city known as Sanok, and as a result of an illness, Schubert published his poetry very late in his life. He debuted at the age of 47. Secondly, his poetic language resonated with many outside sources. For instance, the multicultural ethnic population has lived for many centuries in Sanok and in suburbs. Schubert was a very sophisticated poet. He transfers his family stories to an universal and relatable sense, with a familiar landscapes filled among historical and cultural content and ordinary people. As a result, I translated a couple of Janusz poems and published in Ukrainian literacy. So we began to communicate, and Janusz invited me to Sanok. During many years of our friendship, we had many readings together, and Janusz dedicated to me few poems and vice versa. As a result, I published a first collection of his poetry translated into Ukrainian in the most prestigious publisher house Kritika in Kyiv. In New York City, I organized a presentation where Elżbieta Czyżewska, the Polish star from 1960s, and my friend in New York City read Janusz poems with me, and Anna Freilich moderated this event. I discovered in Schubert's poetry is a high aesthetism with similar narration and intellectual trends, as well as an individual point of view on the people and the world. Being a very delicate relationship with languages. Schubert, for me, was a kind of keeper in the poetical language in Polish poetry. Maybe a last one. Schubert had a unique gift for visualization experience, telling stories, combining historical and family memories, and alchemically searching for the poetic substance of words. His poems smelled of the needles of the surrounding forest, and at the same time were illuminated by intellect, drawn from books and his own thoughts. They used childish, naive, and philosophical connotation. His poetry language absorbed classical quality and modern extravagance, carved Baroque in depth of expression, irony of writing, and belief in the purpose of the literature, depth and challenges of human life. His poem did not lose its polyphonic sounds. Even then, it was about the rain flowing through the leaky roof on the old Sanok house, and someone there in the attic shoveling and substituting jars.
It is indeed a very unusual life and unusual poetry. Sanok, for our listeners who may not know the geography of Poland very well, Sanok was in the eastern and southernmost corner of Poland. It actually is a very narrow corner, and the indigenous population of this whole area, I mean, this is where Poland borders on the east with Ukraine and on the south with Slovakia, and the indigenous population of this area living on all sides of the borders, very few of them now remains, are called Carpato-Ruthenians, Carpathian Rusins, who speak a dialect of Ukrainian, I believe, and as I said, after the war, many of them were either resettled or moved to Ukraine. But the culture still, there is an atmosphere of this particular culture there. And Schubert was a discovery when he started publishing, and he started publishing seriously, for real, thanks to his friend Antoni Libera. Everybody was shocked by this discovery. Czesław Miłosz, Zbigniew Herbert, Wisława Szymborska, Adam Zagajewski, they say, wow, that this is something that we haven't known about. He's in the direct, in terms of generations, he belongs to the generation of Adam Zagajewski, the generation of the Nowa Fala, the new wave in Poland, but is very, very different in his poetics. So Schubert and this particular poem, why this poem, which treats war in a very indirect, almost nostalgic way? You know, it's the First World War, you know, already part of our history, and seen through a photograph. So it's like double, the indirectness is doubled, you know, by the fact that by the media. Why did you choose this particular poem?
I think that in this poem we can view the perspective of war. In other words, the during and after war. And Schubert built the specific poetic structure of this poem. On the first lines, we understand the poet is telling us about the old photo from 1960s in some small Czech town, Pardubice, located in military corps. And the two young soldiers usually take a photo for memory. It's a normal, right? Mm-hmm. The poets emphasizes that the details depicted in the photo, the taste of the time, and the psychological portrait of the soldiers. Schubert wrote about the unaffected appetite for life, and on the next line and next stanzas, the poet draws a mournful perspective of the soldiers and in the war, because the war, every war has probably negative perspective for land, for people, for soldiers. It's a very, very specific poem, because Schubert doesn't speak to us about battle, about I don't know, army, etc., etc. It's a very, very private and very, very located story about two soldiers and war and what's going on after war.
Thank you. I thought also that is the contrast between death, which war brings, and the appetite of life, as you said, for this young soldier, is this contrast between those two. One is dark force and then is the life force. So thank you. Which of your own poems would you like to pair with Schubert, Pardubice?
I do not even how. No, I do not even know. Probably this poem from 1916, which describes a birth of my grandfather during the artillery shelling. I have one poem about that, but only the year is similar, while everything else is completely different. Mm-hmm. I wanted to say that even in the terrible condition of war, a new life is being born, and it cannot to be stopped or terminated.
Would you like to read it to us, this poem?
No, I doesn't have English translation, unfortunately.
Okay. So I think you choose the one about the war of Igor War, right? This one you would like to read.
Yes, I'm gonna to read War. This poem I wrote in February 24, in the first day of when Russia brutally attacked Ukraine. And this poem was immediately translated into English and published in Los Angeles Review of Books. And it's very important for me, because I think that many of Ukrainian poems about war and about contemporary war translated into English. It's working like some kind of cultural propaganda of against Russian troops, against Russian propaganda, and against this brutally war. Okay, I'm gonna read. War. Lord, the way Tachina writes, and Bely, and Block, and Yesenin, the way they surrounded us on all four sides. Give us strength and power, hastily packed suitcase and bread. Naturally, they sly foxes lie that we have neither shields or centuries. Igor leads us somewhere over the dawn with his regiments, today with the February snow, and tomorrow with the bloody shield. And their dark forces come from Tmu Tarakan and Mokshas and Chud, shoot at our location, hit at the position we take. So, what is there in the tale of Igor's campaign? And what in there in ancient sounds? You, jumping barefoot as a wolf, spreading the spit of the devil, reached our river and borders, reach my clenched heart. Your blackened icons can't even be cleansed with milk. Lord, the way Tachina writes about Kyiv, Messiah, about the country, why didn't we learn this poem by heart? Bleed my heart, bleed.
It's
Wonderful.
a beautiful, beautiful
Thank you.
poem.
But we also need some footnotes, I guess, to this
Yeah.
poem, because it mentions several names that may not be known to our listeners. Tachina is the Ukrainian poet, right?
Yeah.
Of the early 20th century, as far as I know.
Yes, he was born in 1891, and he died in 1967. Yes, it's a first half of 20th centuries.
And he talks about Bely and Block and Yesenin,
Yeah.
who were Russian poets of approximately the same time. And Ihor, the tale of Ihor's campaign is considered to be one of the earliest monuments, records, literary records of East Slavic people. It tells about an expedition of one of the Kievian princes against the Pechengi, right? That means the Turkish tribe that semi-nomadic tribe that lived in the steppes north of the Black Sea. It also treats war, especially the current war in Ukraine, in a very indirect way. We have certain tropes that point us in this direction, like, for instance, February, like the lying foxes that tell that Ukraine has neither shields nor sentries, that it's not a country, it's not a nation.
Yes.
And that's what Russian propaganda is telling. But this indirectness, how can you explain your? You once, I think, said or wrote that you had to dress your poetry in military fatigues or military camouflage, which was not the natural way of your poetry. So could you tell about this, us about this indirectness of approaching a very direct and a very current subject?
Yes, that this historical parallel in the mention of the great Ukrainian poet Pavlo Tychina, and his poem about Turn Kyiv should compare to the reader's imagination of different times but similar situation. In 1990, Tychina wrote poem about Kyiv, about Russian poet, about turn of Kyiv, and about probably Ukrainian-Russian relationship, because we must remember that 1990s, it's after Bolshevik invasion on the Ukraine, and Tychina reacted on this because he's a Ukrainian poet. He understanding situation very well. I think that this parallel and this allusion to Tychina is very important in this poem, particularly in this poem, because I linked the similar and same situation. But in 20th century, that Ukraine's many times has a war on our own land. And that, if we're talking about the tale of Igor's campaign, it's also very important literary piece for Eastern Slavic literature. And I wanted to also links for it's a very old time. But I wrote poems also about Bucha and Mariupol as a reaction of the natural response to the tragic occurrences and the brutal killing of peaceful people. I don't know which way is better to write about war. Maybe as Georg Trakl or Paul Celan. I don't know. Neither we could be sure what a poem about war should be like. One thing I know is that the poet's speech about the war must be frugal and to some extent emotional. And that's when I read information about Russian attack on the Ukraine, that my emotional was like where I describe in this poem, war. It's you naturally, right?
My question actually, what is the role of poet and poetry in the time of war? So thank you for answering it. Maybe I thought if you can talk also about the inspiration. I know the inspiration of for your poems in general. Where is coming from? This is very this poem War. We are going through it right now, but general, where is the inspiration? What is your poetry about?
It's a very hard question.
I know.
Because yesterday that Bogdan Zadura asked me, listen, how many poems you wrote about your literary career? Because he's right now writing article for the preface for preparing book translated into Poland and published will be in Częstochowa. I think okay, it's a good question, and I looking on that my selected book, and approximately 350 poems is too much. I think. Yes, I was born in Chertkiv. It's a very small located city in Ternopil region. But my childhood I spent in the village Bazar. It's a probably 30 kilometers away Chertkiv, with a family of my grandmother and grandfather, because my parents divorced when I was 5 years, and you know, that's typical situation. Parents divorce and child going to grandfather and grandmother for the mother's side. It's a very interesting time for me, because I'm also grow up in the different threads of narration of that generation before me. Yes, that my grandfather, grandmother told me about Austria time, about Polish rules time, and they are every time compare with the Soviet time. And I'm listening many words, German words, Polish words, Yiddish words, and right now when I write my poetry or prose or essays, I'm used some kind of the words. And it's a very interesting process, because I'm thinking, okay, I must use these words because it's like some kind of atmosphere of this time, and it's good for Ukrainian language, I think. Yes, and when I arrived at the United States, I open New York City like a text. You know, it's I'm looking on New York City like a child. Yes, because I'm lived in Ternopil. Ternopil is a also small city, probably 200,000 or 300,000 people with the population. And many of my books after my arrived to United States was about New York, about experience new life, about America. But in the last years, couple years, probably 5, I'm looking, I think that I'm changed my optical viewing, and I often write about Ukraine, about my local place where I was born, and it's a very interesting transformation for me, like a writer. Yes, I very like landscape. I'm a very urbanic poet or writer, but also I like write about villages, Halician, especially villages, about my childhood, about generation of my grandma and grandpa. It's some kind of themes of my creativity.
Any American influences? I'm just reading your winter letters in the English translation, the bilingual edition, which is very useful. And I must say, I see the echoes. I mean, probably not the echoes, but certain affinities, similarities with the so-called New York School of Poets. John Ashbery, Frank O'Hara, you know, those street scenes, you know, very common, very usual. When suddenly something starts to happen there, some sparkle there, and those fugues, like, you know, poems that start with some images and go through sequences of images, and they end with something that is a conclusion, but the conclusion is not overdone. It's very subtle conclusion, and that I associate with New York School of Poets, that was especially active in the 60s and 70s. I don't know, maybe just an accident, and maybe just an accidental similarity. The translations also are very good. They loosen the structure, because your stanzas and your stanza structure is quite dense and regular, not in the sense of rhyming, but in the length and syllabic rhythm. The translations loosen it a little bit and move it more in the direction of poetic prose, but it works fine, for this kind of poetry. It is quite great,
Yes, I very liked the New York School of Poets, and believe me, in 2002 or 3, probably, when I was in New York only 2 or 3 years, I met John Ashbery in his apartment on 22nd Street. We spoke with Ashbery, and I write about this meeting in my poem, Postcard to Bogdan Zadura, where I remember where, like, the Ashbery asking me, where are you from? I'm told to him, yes, I'm Ukraine. Ukraine, it's a Europe. Yes, of course, Europe. It's eastern part of Europe. Ukraine. Ukraine. Okay. That's very funny. But John was very friendly, and we spoke about poetry, about New York, about life, probably 1 hour in his apartment. And it was a first and last meeting me with John Ashbery, because another of poets of New York groups of New York School in that time was died. Yes. But yes, in some kind of influence on my poetry is from New York School of New York Poets. It's Ashbery and Kenneth Cole or John or Frank O'Hara.
Yeah.
I like that poetry, and I think in that generation of American poets spoke its natural language about ordinary or similar situation, and it's probably poets influences not only for me. I thinking about generation, Brilliant generation of Polish poets.
Yes.
And some poets in the Slovenia, and yes, it's a very interesting question, and very interesting way, like poetry and poets influenced on each other, for different generation and from different languages and different cultural.
Well, so I wasn't wrong entirely. Bogdan Zadura, Julian Kornhauser, and I, 3 of us, visited John Ashbery in the same apartment in Gramercy in New York before John Ashbery visited Poland. He was in Poland in 1980. So we have all the same connections and same fascinations. We're quite far from the subject of war. I don't know, Małgorzata, would you like to?
Thank you for this fantastic conversation. I have a suggestion. If Mr. Makhno, could you read part of your poem in Ukrainian for the end of our conversation?
Title is Psalma Buchi. Bucha is a city. Вот. Псальма Бучі. Ми тепер їх уже не покличемо ні питальним знаком, ні кличною формою, яка у нас є. В кого руки заламано й скручено, хто лежить по вулицях Бучі, по дворах під дощем гниє. Припильнує їх чорний ворон чорним оком, чорний, як ворог, чи пригорне їх херувим. Най мій вірш буде їм псальмою за Андрієм, Петром, Оксаною, солоспівом і хоровим. Найпропущені мною сполучники вам полегшать побачити Бучу і почути тривожний дзвін. Херувим в камуфляжній формі най покаже стовпи і опори, і пробиті зазубрини стін. Най згадає усіх поіменно у цій псальмі кожен іменник, як присипаний глиною світ. Хто ще дихав учора під соснами, хто дивився у очі псові при серпневім падінні звізд. Я ж не знаю, якою печальною мусить бути печаль моя з псальмою, і яких ще потрібно слів. Буча, скручена скотчем і розстріляна, звірина, із якою зустрілись ми 10 рогів та 7 голів. Перед тими страстями і страсною седемицею ми із Тарасом над Андрієм, Петром, Оксаною, що пливуть по небу ридванами і гучними, як дзвін, риданнями. Поклонімося Бучі псальмою.
The images from Bucha will become, most unfortunately, you know, the iconic images of our time. You know, they are those images from the Second World War, from the war in Vietnam, you know, that are kind of etched in our memory and in our consciousness. And I'm sure that Bucha, the pictures from Bucha, from the streets of Bucha, massacre of civilians, will join this very sad anthology.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was fantastic. You know, we talked about so many different subjects, but it was fascinating. You know,
Yeah.
I'm glad that I was not fantasizing about those connections with the New York school, because it's very easy to follow the false path of analogy. But in this case, I hope I was right.
I love the connection between our motherland, Ukraine and Poland, and our childhood, and then New York as two sources of inspiration, and then the European literature and the European education and the American literature, poetry. It's a fascinating topic. Mr. Makhno, thank you so much. It was great conversation. We appreciate it and thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank
It was
you.
great. Thank you.